Bread.
Welcome to Breaking Bread and welcome to Nevada County Television. I'm Eric Thome and I'll be here in the next hour with Jedediah Biaggi and George Rebane. We're going to be talking about a subject you might not know is very important to you, but I think you will think so at the end. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Before that, I'd like to reassure viewers who may have heard reports, actually seen reports, that NCTV was closing down. At one point, the board of directors actually announced that it would only be cablecasting till the middle of October. But so many people were so concerned by this decision that a good 2, 3, 4 dozen people have gotten together again and again and again to figure out what we could do to save the station. And two people in particular, Dan Holler and Keith Logan, have spearheaded a movement to reorganize it, possibly move it, but in any case make sure that we continue to fulfill our mission as a provider of public educational and government cablecasting for Nevada County. Things will be very different as they get reorganized, but we are quite convinced that we have a good future, and we hope that this is something that means something to you. One of the reasons we want to keep going is because of programs like this, locally produced discussions of events and issues that are important to all of us. In this case, it's one that, as I said, you might not actually think is important to you. It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a multinational trade agreement that's been being negotiated for the last half dozen years, that has gotten more and more nations signing on and has gotten more and more controversial as it gets closer to completion. Whether it ever actually reaches completion, I don't know, because quite a few people, as I said, are quite concerned. And the people who are with me, Jed Biaggi and George Rebane, are among those. The three of us come from a wide range of political persuasions, but as we try to do on this program, we try to find common ground where we can all agree. In this case, it seems that in spite of the difference of our initial persuasions, we perhaps agree at the beginning. I'm not quite sure. We'll find out in the next few minutes, and then we'll find out how much we agree at the end. Why don't I start, since you're to that side, with Jedediah Biaggi. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you learned about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and why you became concerned about it?
Sure. Well, I first learned about it. Well, I'm running as a candidate for District 4 Nevada County supervisors, and at the supervisor level, you'd almost think that this wouldn't play a part. But one of my platform aspects is a public bank. And a public bank is, without getting into too much detail, is a means that we can use our tax dollars to increase business in our county. Ways that it can do that is it offers loans at below market rate. In the TPP, that's going to be made. It won't be made. We won't have the ability to do that. It actually will attack public banking and not allow a local bank to lend money below market. And that's actually how I got introduced to the TPP specifically, though I've been aware and really sort of against international trade agreements in general. So this is, just as I found out, a secret trade agreement. So
now, George, when I first mentioned this to you and invited you to come on the program, you were the one who said, well, nobody cares about that. Nobody knows anything about it. But, of course, you know quite a lot about it. And how did this come about?
As we were discussing before, at least the three of us, and I think the other co-hosts of Breaking Bread, we're political junkies. We deal in this kind of information day in and day out. So my, just in case the viewers are coming in for the first time, I'm pleased to be a guest. I'm one of the 5 co-hosts of Breaking Bread here, and so I get to someday in the future sit in that seat again. So we keep up with these things. I run a blog. I do a radio commentary. We're doing this television series, so we read these things day in and day out. But when we say TPP, and you'll hear that a lot during this hour, that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. I don't know how far we want to go back. This is introduction. You're going to start this thing out with
Why don't, since you've already started, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is and where it came from?
Okay. TPP is actually a plan B for the United States in this kind of a multilateral trade agreement game. We wanted, there's an association of Asian countries called ASEAN, ASEAN. The Asian nations, China, of course, is the big kahuna there, even India, Japan, so forth. They got together and said, hey, we need to put together yet another trade agreement that would allow us to share intellectual property properly, to lower tariffs, to increase commerce across borders, and so forth and so on. And the United States at that point said, hey, we're the world's big kahuna, and we're kind of a Pacific country, and that's almost Asian, and we belong in there also. Well, the others took a look at us and said, no, you don't. And so we tucked our tail between our legs and went home for a bit and came back, all reinvigorated in something new called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we started talking with individual countries, got some traction on it, and now it looks like the Trans-Pacific Partnership at least has as much interest as the original ASEAN multilateral trade agreement did. So there's a lot of concerns, and I think we're going to get into the details of it here, but it seems to be one of the things that immediately kind of raises the red, well, at least the yellow flag on it, is that the entire agreement is being negotiated very sub rosa. Now, some part of that, of course, is understandable because, you don't want to do all your laundry in public. But nobody's heard. I would doubt whether one viewer in 100 here has heard of the TPP. And that itself is a concern. And the accusation for it is it's going to be another NAFTA kind of a thing. It's going to benefit big corporations, and it's going to be, I think Judd will go into it in greater detail, but Judd called it before a race to the bottom. And that's race to the bottom not for the upper educated classes, but race to the bottom to, for the workers who no longer are very competitive on the job markets. And I will get on my soapbox about that when the time comes here in a few minutes. So let me conclude with that and turn it back to our host.
And I'll just give some comparisons of historically where this sort of agreement came from, how they have developed, and the different ways they can develop. If you go way back centuries, before the unification of Germany, the various small German states all entered into various unions, a currency union and customs union and so on, that gradually developed into one country, although it involved several wars. After World War II, the European nations began with a coal and steel agreement, especially between France and Germany and then Belgium and the Netherlands. This led eventually to the European Union. That was a long, long process of 60 years, and most of it was carried out in public. On the other hand, there's been things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was like the TPP, carried out largely in secret and then presented to the American Congress as an up or down, a fast-track decision. They had 90 days in which to either approve it or disapprove it. It could not be amended, and the debate was quite limited. And now quite a few people are very disillusioned with what happened with NAFTA, and they're afraid that this may be the same thing or possibly even worse.
Can I add something
Yes.
at this point? Yeah. One of the big motivations for these kinds of trade agreements is that, as Eric was saying, Germany is actually a younger country than the United States. Bismarck brought it into existence in the 1870s. Before that, it was made up of all these little provinces and city-states and so forth. So when you were transporting goods from Hamburg down to, let's say, Munich, you were crossing a sovereign state's border every 20 to 50 miles, stopping, having to have your load checked and paying tariffs and so forth and so on. And things were really being kept back by this kind of a process of trade. And so out of that came a kind of a statement that now guides a lot of these trade agreements. And that is, if goods don't cross borders, armies will. So that's something that nations have looked at and said, you know what? Historically, that's correct. Nations that trade with each other, they don't fight each other very much because there's common economic interests. So all kinds of trade agreements have come up because of that one basic understanding. If goods don't cross borders, armies will.
Though that hasn't played out 100% of the time,
No.
as I've shown.
Of course.
That is something that is agreed upon generally, but it's not completely true. But it does help, yes. I mean, and I think the problem is with this is it's nice to have free trade, as we do say, in the United States, where we can cross state boundaries, stuff like that, and we can do trade internally. But now we're reaching a level of global governance at this, and I think that's another problem with the TPP. Its international status negates any of our jurisdictional claims that we can have on ourselves. Whatever laws we pass locally can be easily overturned by an international trade agreement. And specifically in this case, the TPP, they're going to create a global court that corporations will be able, a trade court. Yeah. Corporations will be able to sue local jurisdictions, local governments, counties, state, whatever. They can take this to this world court, and that jurisdiction will be over our Constitution, over our state constitution, federal constitution, and whatever county agreements we have.
This has already happened with NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, that companies, corporations have sued particular countries because the local laws would not allow them to make the profit that they otherwise believed they would because of environmental restrictions or labor rules or things like that. Those are two of the ones that are most worrisome. And in a number of cases, the WTO and the NAFTA courts have decided in favor of the corporations, that their right to make a profit was more important than the member nations' right to protect their environments or their working forces or their free speech or many other items. This could go in many, many directions. And Jed, you actually have a list of the specific areas you think this could have an effect.
Yeah, I've been doing further research, but yeah, I have a small list of things that I think it'll be specifically addressing. Besides the global court, it's going to the global banking industry that we're dealing with right now with the mass derivative and risky derivative markets. That's going to be further pushed around the world. A buy local campaign. There's going to be restrictions on buy local. In essence, I mean, in some ways, you can almost say like, oh, where did the Buy America go? Well, it's gone in the free trade agreements because there's actually restrictions about doing such promotion. Another way that it affects the buy local is if our county government wants to decide to engage in some sort of project, and it puts it out to bid to, say, a number of companies to do it, we're required to allow foreign companies to be in this bidding process. We can't say in our county, be like, oh, we want a county corporation or a county company, some private company from the county to do this work. They can be involved in the negotiation process or in the bidding process, but the buy local aspects of the TPP will make it such that we must include and honor or at least look at bids from corporations that perhaps could be multinational corporations, say, based in China or in other places. And then, of course, specifically, there are other things like food security, huge concern about food security in the TPP with pushing of Monsanto and GMO organisms. Debated or not, people may or may not want it in their area. And if someone decides that they want to restrict GMO usage, you could easily be found yourself into this international tribunal court that we mentioned. It's going to affect the internet with backdoor monitoring of information, so we won't have a free internet in that sense. Another thing that I think is actually this one's very interesting, but Obamacare will, in essence, if you don't like Obamacare, and this can come from all sorts of different standpoints, but I have a problem with Obamacare because the insurance companies have maintained their grasp inside this healthcare area, and it's a place that profit gets bled off between the individual and the doctor. Well, that's an aspect of Obamacare. It's been ingrained in it, and this aspect is also going to be pushed around the world as another way to ensure profit at a big corporate company level. So those are the primary things that I've listed. There's lots of other things, but that's in general. I could talk more about each of those things as to why it's important.
Now, when we were talking before the program, and we will get back to some of the points that Jed was bringing up, George and I were talking a little bit about the secrecy. Theoretically, there have been no drafts released of what is in the TPP so far after many years of negotiation. I sent an email to the U.S. Trade Representative and asking for a copy of the latest draft. I never even got a response. That was about 2 weeks ago. And at the beginning of the program, George, you were saying that you could understand some secrecy, but not the level that's actually being forced upon us now.
It seems like this is going to be, similar to NAFTA, that our legislative process in the United States is going to get this as a done deal. The momentum will be there, voted up or down, and the momentum will be such that nobody will vote it down, and it'll pass. So I want to pick up on what Jed was saying. My main concern about these kinds of agreements is the retention of our national sovereignty. I'm real big on that. I believe that the world would be a better place when we have countries competing commercially, but the countries being sovereign nation states. So in other words, I kind of hold globalism, meaning a lot of trade going on and making it more or less facile, and one worldism as being two separate concepts. To me, in reading about TPP, it seems like it is a gallop toward one worldism. In other words, we're having literally by fiat, as we've been talking here, trade tribunals, subverting local legislatures, subverting sovereignty, in other words. When we take a look at, what will the United States benefit from this? Well, if you go to the website of the United States Trade Representative, you see a lot of the, I'll call it propaganda because that's what it is. A lot of the propaganda is talking about small and medium-sized businesses benefiting tremendously from this agreement. And you start looking at where will the small and medium-sized businesses, get their benefit, and there is nothing that shows that those size businesses will get the benefit. But multinationals, especially those subsidized in the various countries by their governments, are going to have a tremendous gain in that. There's, like for instance, the trade balance. Trade balance, the way it's computed today, is hokey. The way they compute trade balance is they take a look at the value of goods going across a border to one country, getting some manufacturing done over there, and crossing it again. Every time it crosses the border prior to it being sold to the end consumer, somebody gets written down in the national account that, hey, they either got a deficit or they got a balance. That's immaterial. because at the end, the product is worth something, and somebody's going to pay for it, and that's the value that you should be looking at. So the better way that nobody wants to compute trade balances is by what's called value added. We don't do it that way. We keep tally of just the stuff going across the borders, no matter, and put an arbitrary price on that and put it into our account. If you look at what the United States has done, what benefit it could get, in the early years after World War II, we were the only surviving, if you will, big industrial power. And the world was broken, and we obviously were the supplier of choice. And we enjoyed supplying everything to everybody. The trade agreements back in those days were hard to negotiate because all the other countries wanted to grow up and they wanted to put tariffs on goods in order to build up their own automobile or radio or what manufacturing, whatever it was. But now we've come a long way, and we look at what are other countries doing. Other countries are trying to do even more so what they did then. They're trying to get out of the extractive and the agricultural industries. This is where they make their money. Of course, the United States is the leading agricultural nation in the world, and we are now coming back as a world energy supplier also. Those are our, if you will, our seminal products. What we used to be prime in was the so-called STEM areas: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, those careers. They gave us a technological lead. We made gizmos. We pioneered everything from the iPhone on down to, Zenith radios back in the 1950s and so forth. Well, those days are gone. We don't have primacy there anymore. Every other country wants to get away from selling turnips, across their borders and starting to do some engineering or some advanced medicine or what have you. And they are making the starting of those businesses a heck of a lot simpler and easier than the United States is. In the United States, we are making it more and more complex to start a new business, and in other countries they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we want to get businesses started. I can relate an anecdote where a person who worked for me, a PhD, worked for, I'll say the name of the company, bizrate.com. We were an e-commerce concentrator. He learned his trade from us, took a look at where he would make his fortune. He looked back at his home country of China. He went back there and started the enormous business concentrator of China. He basically copied the U.S. model and did it there. Had every right to do that. This is our brain drain. And looking at the TPP coming full circle, I see that this is going to do nothing more than make it harder for us to attract people over here, because it's easier to start businesses and become very rich in other countries. By the way, the gentleman's name is Haitao Wang, and he's a very, very, very wealthy man right now. And that's in 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, but what you're talking about, what you're really referring to, the problem is the outsourcing of, just the companies in our country. With these, as soon as these trade agreements happen, and it's not, and I think that perhaps the misnomer that the one thing that I had a problem with what you said was it's harder to start a business, and we're
in the United States,
and I can say that maybe that's true in some ways, and maybe you're arguing that in the fact that there's environmental concerns and things like that are preventing people from starting businesses. But I think that really we're at a chicken and an egg aspect, and I think that what happened was we had the international trade agreements signed first, or China was normalized as a trade partner, and now it's okay for that sort of thing to happen. With these trade agreements, and this is where it comes into the race to the bottom aspect. What happens is, as soon as we open up the free trade, and a company has the right now to go to these other countries, like when we signed our and basically it's called a permanent normal trade relation status, or it used to be called the most favored nation. China, that was given to China in 1999.
Yeah.
And that's an act of Congress. I mean, that's not an aspect of, the environment, it was too hard for business environment to create a business. That's not what happened. As soon as that went down, things started getting exported, just as it happened in NAFTA, which was in NAFTA specific to Mexico. Now, a lot of people remember, just let me finish real quick. A lot of people remember that when NAFTA started, the manufacturing immediately eroded in the United States.
Exactly.
All of these things moved down onto the United States, and the people in the United States, okay, and this is where I'm going to address the actual race to the bottom part, they lost their jobs. Okay, now there's a ripple effect in their own community, and that community started to erode because there was no manufacturing base. Now, these were people, lower educated people in most cases. These aren't your PhDs. These aren't your higher educated people. These are the common folk. And when these people lost their job, that's when the ripple effect becomes real, and suddenly a town will die. Okay, and we'll have, and it's that sort of aspect's the race to the bottom. Now, we don't have jobs to support people in our local communities, and they can't. And it's you get this division where the middle income people are completely destroyed, and you have elite growing and poor people growing. That's where we're at in the United States right now. It's a race to the bottom to find the cheapest place to manufacture around the world, whereas where they're leaving gets one step down further in that peg of.
Exactly. And when GM went to China, for instance, they not only went to China with their cars, but very quickly they followed with their tooling and their manufacturing expertise, and they poured it into China because that was part of the agreement, that they could manufacture right there with a lot cheaper labor, and their market was right there.
Absolutely.
And so forth.
So the infrastructure was completely, I mean, now the next great factory was built in China instead of here.
Exactly. So, and recently, in fact, Charles Murray wrote his latest and greatest book, Coming Apart. And it's about the white class divisions. It starts with the whites between 1960 and 2010. And he highlights exactly what you were talking about, the separation of the classes, of the cognitively, let's say, not as able as the others on top. And there's about 30% of them. He left the middle class out for a while. But what has happened with that 30% down at the bottom is that they are the contributors to systemic, I should say, unemployment. I have run some numbers that say a conservative estimate of the systemic unemployment by 2020 will be 70+ million people. I was a little bit embarrassed the other day reading some very prominent people who run numbers already saying that number has been passed, that in effect today unemployed and underemployed, because we're playing numbers games like mad to try to get the employment numbers up, 30-hour work weeks, okay. Nobody mentions that there's 63% only in participation in the workforce when we quote our unemployment numbers and so forth and so on, and that number is going down, with every passing day. So we have this permanently under or unemployed class that is growing here in the United States, 30%. The 20% on top, the percentage is staying the same, but because of our educational system being essentially in the toilet in the country, the bottom part is growing a heck of a lot more and faster. And there is nothing that I have been able to read in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, that is going to in any way benefit that bottom 30%. It's just going to add to them more and more and more, because the people overseas in the developing countries, they want to have their place in the sun also. And right now they provide the exact same or even better labor, if you will, at much lower prices.
The interesting thing that's happening, though, is that inequality is growing not just in the U.S., but in worldwide.
Yes, yes.
And I think it is actually one of the salient features of capitalism as a system, that you have to have a certain number of impoverished people at the bottom to keep pressure on everybody else. When nations were able to regulate their economies to some degree internally, as happened in, you can argue, either the New Deal or World War II, when essentially the government became the employer of last resort and propped up wage levels all across the board. This happened in many, many countries, but once you take away national sovereignty of one sort or another and put everybody at the mercy of the corporations, the same thing happens everywhere.
Well, but that even the government as the employer of last resort has not proven to work any place. It most certainly did not work in the Depression here in the United States.
I said the Depression, the New Deal or World War II. I happen to believe it was World War II.
Well, World War II was the great judgment.
Yeah.
Was it capitalism? Or?
Well, state capitalism, a mixed system, but it certainly allowed the corporations to survive and flourish. And they did flourish for a while, and then I think got greedy and decided, well, we want more. And we can do it by pushing national governments around.
I, as a conservatarian, as I call myself, look with a very gimlet eye on any private venture that needs government subsidies to survive. I don't think that bureaucracy, with its inefficiencies, its lack of feedback, constructive feedback paths and so forth, that's only limited to governments. Big corporations can have the exact same thing. And when the two of them get together, then you got problems.
Right. That's exactly.
And I mean, the market has been mangled so badly it doesn't resemble a free market in no way. Yeah.
Exactly. And when in reality, large corporations are an aberration to a free market because they create monopolies and aspects like that. So, and that's what this is. I mean, if we look at that combination of creating a larger poor class that now becomes more sufficient on government handouts to even meet their needs, and good or bad. I mean, I think that most people are going to be like, well, I'd much rather be self-sufficient. I would rather be sufficient on my own means and not suddenly have, the government pulling out the aid. I mean, because I think even poor people would look at poor people, lower class people that are stuck in that position that can't create a job, as you would say it would be easy to do. I think it's that overall. I think I've lost my train of thought.
Well,
and it was
jump in there, host.
If you remember what we were talking about, it'll come right back in.
Well, I was going to move on to another.
Oh, so here we go.
Okay.
So what that's dealing with is that we're creating those huge groups of poor people, which now resembles a socialist environment. But on the other end, we have these associations between large transnational corporations and governments working hand in hand to line their situation. So we're looking at a one-world fascist government with the people repressed to a socialist aspect in that means. I mean, it's a dichotomy, interestingly enough, that could be opposites, but they're working together.
But you can't call it fascist anymore because it encompasses the globe. You can call it fascist if it were regional,
Yeah.
So
well, if we have created a global one-world government, let's say there's a pseudo-court that has judgment over all of, well, then now we're looking very closely at this construction of an actual one-world government built upon the backs of corporations.
What you're describing, of course, is what's coming into place, or appears to be coming into place through agreements like, the Trans-Pacific here, is a two-tiered socialism. You have corporate socialism at the top, hand in glove with the government, and then you have the poor plebes at the bottom over there who are just basically pawns and keep up the ruse of democracy because they're compliant voters.
Yeah.
You can just dangle anything in front of them, they'll vote for you.
I think what you're calling corporate socialism is exactly what I'm calling fascism. I think they are exactly the same.
Well, Mussolini described his system as a corporate state.
Yeah.
The only reason I wanted to get a little picky on the words there was that fascism usually has gone into what was known as National Socialism, right? Socialism within a sovereign nation state, us against them. But if you become global, there is no us against them. Then it becomes
Right.
one worldism.
But it's
Although-
but we're looking at the
But the structure of
corporations
governance
and
is a two-tiered socialism.
And you could argue that what keeps the corporate socialism of the United States has kept it going in the last 30 or 40 years is largely military spending, which requires at least a perception of an enemy or possibility of an enemy. And that
Well, you don't want to go and say that we didn't have an enemy.
I actually wanted to go to another
It'll
subject.
destroy the program.
It would.
I think besides the military-industrial complex, there are other
complexes,
that have
yes,
been built
yeah.
up. That,
Yeah.
I
Go
mean,
for
we've got
them.
the pharmaceutical.
Right.
So now we can agree.
Now we can
that there
agree
are
on,
other,
yeah.
other
I
complexes.
just wanted to throw in one slightly different point of view because unlike the two of you, I think I actually would favor a one-world government.
Yes.
But not the sort that we're heading toward.
We're waiting for you to come
Yeah,
up with that.
I would actually. It's too bad that the United Nations had a great deal of promise, but the largest members, including the Soviet Union to some degree, but probably the United States even more, have exercised their veto power and kept it from ever getting anywhere. A lot of conservatives worry about the Agenda 21, the UN scheme that's going to come in and take away local sovereignty.
No,
That's totally bogus.
It isn't.
those are
Nobody says it
completely
that way. I don't think
Okay.
you're going to anybody who really, let's say, ascribes to what is happening as going along with the objectives of Agenda 21 as claiming that Agenda 21 actually is a program that is going to take over. No, it isn't.
No.
Agenda 21 is a label of convenience.
Right. But
Back in 1988, 89, they had this conference down there. They put up the list of, these objectives to,
Yeah.
stack and pack and all this good stuff. It's being used as a label. So,
Right.
so attacking the people who use Agenda 21 is saying, we believe there's a UN conspiracy.
There are an awful lot
I
of people
know
who do
there
believe
are,
it.
yeah, but they don't know what Agenda 21 is.
Exactly.
That side then, well, because this is how I see it coming down from that side. I mean, have you read Agenda 21?
Oh, yes.
Have you read-
Yes.
I mean, it's a large document.
Yeah.
Very large,
300
yeah.
pages
Yeah.
long. And there's a part in Agenda 21 where they talk about the funding and how we're going to interact with the funding and implementation of this. How are they going to do it? They're going to work with GAP. They're going to work with WTO.
The ICLEIs are already...
But that's not the point. The fact is that the Agenda 21 push is working with World Trade Organizations and World Trade agreements to keep its agenda.
The other end
process.
is working with local governments.
Yeah. But what it does is that
Pull us back to
subverts-
Trans-Pacific over here.
Well, no, what I want to go back into is the whole question of world
Sure,
government,
okay.
because I actually would very strongly favor a well-organized, representative, let's say democratic world government.
We'll
but I
work
would
on you on that.
also favor, I think it's been more and more realized that nation states in many cases are much too large and are unwieldy.
Yes, yes.
And what you really need is a overarching world government to keep the peace and to arrange for real interaction, non-hostile interaction among the nations, but then at the other end, more and more local control.
Well-
and it's local control that is really being threatened by the WTO or the TPP.
There's where we agree, and I think we also agree on, the optimal size of communities and nation states and so forth has been studied a lot over the last 50 years by sociologists. And there seems to be that the optimum size of a community is somewhere between 20 and 50,000 people. When you get beyond that, you don't know. And we're in the optimal size right here in Nevada County, which is beautiful.
That's exactly what I mean, that's why I'm running.
Yeah,
that's
exactly, yeah.
because I think that at a county level, we have a great level of jurisdiction that we can implement to protect ourselves from these things. And that's exactly the reason why I'm running, because I think that local self-governance is the solution.
And for countries, the optimal size is somewhere around 5 million. And if you look at it, you begin to see countries like, Switzerland, like Denmark, like Norway, and so forth and so on, that seem to have, even though we can get into details on other programs there, but people are more happier in smaller countries like this. And as you said, we get to be unwieldy. The only problem is, which, you one-worlders haven't solved yet, is when you describe this overarching government, we don't know how to stop its overarching, because it has a tendency to start putting its tendrils right down to the local level and giving one-size-fits-all stuff.
Right, and the European Union, which I generally use as an example of the way to reach cooperative agreements, trade agreements, definitely has become
exactly so.
Some bureaucratic, and a lot of Italians and Poles and Welsh dislike being told what to do from Brussels. So that's one of the reasons, though, that in Europe, Scotland may become essentially autonomous.
They're trying. Catalonia.
So might Wales, so might Catalonia. Yeah. And this is the direction that we should probably be going to.
Well,
which is
son of a gun.
Also, that's why we don't think that one world government aspect will work, because we have to have say in our and we don't. Yeah. I in no way do I see, if we had a one world government, how would my voice be heard at all? I mean, it's not heard at the national level. It's not heard at the state level. Let's make another level even further that I can yell as loud as I want, and it's not.
If it were there, if its purpose was to keep the peace and to arrange for interaction among all the local units, people might then be more content with their local units.
But remember, the USSR achieved that, keeping the peace among all kinds of different ethnicities. They did it real well for 75 years.
Yeah. So did Saddam Hussein. So did Tito.
Exactly so. Yeah. So, but we don't like those kinds of ends. But anyway, you talk about the United States on my blog, Rebaine's Ruminations. I'll give unabashed plug for that. We discuss and debate, liberals, conservatives, a possible future for the United States that might be more handleable. It comes under the rubric of the Great Divide. Should the United States be a group of confederates, a confederacy of smaller regional states, with this overarching thing that, you have foreign policy be unified and so forth. Anyway, but my question at this point is for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If we're all in violent agreement here, and we have viewers out there who, are perhaps hearing about it for the first time, what do we tell people to do after they get informed? Obviously, we want people to get informed, but what can we recommend?
Very first step is because, we're in an immediate time frame right now where we could actually have an effect, is opposing fast track. Mm-hmm. And we can contact members of Congress and stop fast track. Fast track is, as was mentioned already, is yay or nay vote. The bill comes before you. You have to vote yes or no. There's no debate. There's no amendments, and usually you get momentum really fast, and everyone says yes. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is stop fast track, and then once that happens, that will give us the time to shine some light on the TPP, because that's the next thing. Once you get the general public even reading what it is, now you're going to get opposition. Right now they're working on those two things, fast track and secrecy. I think if we eliminate those, that's going to be our steps to stop.
Fast track is an easier thing to stop.
I agree.
Secrecy is...
Concurred. I agree.
Yeah.
That's fast track. That's why it's the first step. We can have immediate response, and as far as I know, they're planning on doing that this month and or next month and vote on that.
So can we cut to Doug LaMalfa's phone number and Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein here?
Well, we'll fix it in post.
We'll fix it in post.
As a heads up, I do know that LaMalfa is for the TPP. We've already done some, hey, how do you stand? Why do you stand this way? I do know our local representative, LaMalfa, is for it. He was initially against the TPP. He did some shenanigans, I shall say, in a nice way. Got rice included in the TPP, and he's flopped. He's for it. That's obviously his background, his bread and butter.
He also receives government subsidies.
Huge receiver of government subsidies for his farming.
Well, Joanne and I know Doug well, and in fact, we have an upcoming lunch with him. And one of our little sticking points is farm subsidies. Uh-huh. And LaMalfa, for instance, is on record saying, hey, I'm against them, but nobody can be the first one out. If you're the first one to say, I won't take the subsidies, your costs just become uncompetitive. Because why? It's an entire government-subsidized industry.
Sure.
ConAgra, ADM, all those guys are getting huge amounts of money. And I have a feeling
those guys
this
have
is
huge
this
amounts
is
of money.
this is part of that relationship of big corporations together with government, and they're the ones who are pushing initiatives like that because it makes it easier for them to move massive goods across the borders and have the lowest cost structure because you get to pick and choose, mix and match where your parts get manufactured, how they get transported, and so forth and so on. And the race to the bottom continues.
Well, if you're going to meet with him, you could say, instead of being the first one out of subsidies, which might be a dangerous thing, he could be the first one to oppose what are essentially a new form of entitlements.
You're talking about TPP?
Yeah.
Exactly. So
yeah. So I hope you do argue with him.
No, it'll be an interesting discussion because I'm glad you brought that up, Jed, that he had flipped, because I was not aware that he had, but it makes a lot of sense because if you throw, he's not a rice producer, he's a rice seed producer, but that's the same thing. He feeds into that industry. Yeah. So, to what extent did that influence him? That'll be an interesting conversation. Maybe we'll share that in a future program.
Nice.
and McClintock, and those are the two people we could most affect in this.
And Dan
region.
Logue, if he gets elected.
Right.
Yeah, that'll be interesting because fundamentally, by their philosophies, they are supposed to be backing sovereign nationality, for the United States, to retain sovereign nation state status and not give away our, like the tribunal that you mentioned and so forth for TPP. A lot of contention coming up here.
So you've got two suggestions, which are fight fast track and fight secrecy.
Right.
Start with fast track.
And
Start with fast track.
My third solution is increase local self-governance. Focus on your locality.
Oh, yeah.
Promote things that will keep us sovereign in a sense from all sorts of avenues, electricity, fuel to food to whatever. Focus on your local area, and if everybody focuses on their local area, we're going to have a bunch of a network of locally governed communities that they'll be on the same page. When everyone's concerned about their backyard, you'll find that people are on their same page.
Well, let me get a little soapbox in here. I have been unsuccessfully trying to get the Board of Supervisors to even consider the program, I call it Just Say No. Just the same as we've been talking about Doug Lamalfa saying, hey, refuse that subsidy. Nevada County gets equivalent subsidies. We pay out money and it comes back. But every buck that comes back with an owner's manual attached to it. When can Nevada County be the county that all of a sudden takes one targeted subsidy that we get and says, we refuse it, we're going to do it our own way, and perhaps suffer. We'll maybe have to deal with bigger chuck holes for a longer time, and so forth and so on. But we publicize that. We are not going to be under Sacramento or Washington, D.C.'s dictates in this area. Would that be a movable feast? Would that start going to other counties and so forth? And
I believe that's so, and that's what when I.
Eric, you're for that also.
I'm mixed on that. There are some things, in particular, education. I think a lot of the whole No Child Left Behind, I'm totally opposed to it. It's not a state program, but it does involve a lot of
but you've seen what the government's done with it.
But there are many other cases of statewide organization, legislation, which I'm completely in favor of. I am in favor of more local control, but not total local control, just as I would be in favor of greater national sovereignty, but not total national sovereignty, that we have to give something up at the top for common protection.
We've got to pick a subject where we can really go at each other then.
But in general, I think the more there, and the other thing is that in the United States, historically, local control has tended to be a means of oppression.
Well, but that was during a time when it was like that world round. So you have to be not a statist, but believing in static social philosophy. The world has changed.
Right, and that's
Will
what
we
I'm-
go back in local control and become oppressive again in the United States? I don't see it.
Well,
see how that is
I
true.
do see it with the overturning of the section of the Voting
okay.
Rights Act.
Well,
But that's
well,
another question.
When we had a revolution in the United States, it was for local control, for local self-governance.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it was about. I mean, and it was about freeing ourselves from an
overarching,
far-off
yeah.
government with multinational corporations,
Right.
and they had control of the money supply. I mean, I don't see how it translates now that we should be doing that. I think we obviously need to have local control of all of those things, and that's definitely the aspect. I mean, and as I said, the reason that I got involved in the TPP in the first place was because I wanted a local bank a local county bank that keeps our money locally, so that we won't take that hit that you're talking about when we say no to the subsidies. We now have a self-sufficient money creation aspect that we can do to fund all of these projects, so we don't have to rely on those government subsidies anymore.
But from the very beginning of the United States, there's been a tension between local control and federalism. And actually, I think what we have come up with as a federal republic as opposed to a unitary one has, for the most part, worked well. But there have been times when it's led to extreme conflict, like the Civil War. And I would never give up some degree of federalism. I would like much more local control in many areas, but not in all.
And we should make that a subject of a future
That could
program.
be,
I think we'll have a
absolutely.
whole another hour.
In other words,
Yes.
what form of governance with all these dimensions? Where's the sweet spot?
Yeah.
But back to the TPP. We don't have too much left.
I don't know. I've shot my wad
You
on
shot
it.
your wad.
Yeah, it's. How about you, Jed?
I think that I have said all I need to say about it. I think it's pretty clear.
Okay.
Regularly opposed to it, and we're united in that opposition.
In that opposition,
We're breaking
and we
bread
want
together.
people to get out there and tell other people about it. And I will tell you, two of the best. Other people may find these biased, but I found if you need a single source of information about the TPP, there are two of them that are very excellent. One is the Hightower Lowdown. Jim Hightower from Texas, former agricultural commissioner and general good guy politician, puts out his monthly newsletter, and the one for August was devoted to the TPP, and it's a great rundown. There's also one from the series called OccuCards, and these are put out by the local Occupy members, some of them. They've come up with 21 of them. Number 21 is about the TPP. These are both available around town. There are places where you can find stacks of them. I won't go into all that right now, but
there's one real easy website. It's called
Okay.
flushthetpp.org.
There's even a simpler one. A conservative is plugging
okay, go ahead.
Occupy.com.
Oh, yeah.
Just simply Occupy.com. Go there.
Okay.
You get a snootful on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that'll get you up to speed if we haven't succeeded today. And I'd like, since we have a couple of minutes left and we have shot our wads, to again reassure people that Nevada County Television is not going away. Certainly if we can have discussions like this that get us as roused up as we have gotten and then done, we must be doing something right. And there are quite a few other programs that are produced here that are well worth continuing. I should let people know that NCTV doesn't really produce anything on its own. It's basically has two functions. One is to provide equipment and facilities where people can make their own programs, and this is one of them. It has the cameras, it has the control booth, it has the organization that allows all this to go forward. But it's volunteers who come in and man the cameras, man the control booth. We are volunteers here. NCTV allows us to do that, and we do not want it to go away. And then NCTV, its second function is to get all this out to the public, to cablecast it, so that the government programs all go out. Right now you can get the Board of Supervisors, the City Council meetings, Planning Commission meetings. Some people are saying that as NCTV goes forward, we may start including things like NID meetings. We might include NCTV board meetings. There's a whole lot of opportunities for more openness and more involvement. We hope that as you realize that we aren't going away, that you will get involved in producing your own programs or helping us raise money so that we can disseminate the programs we're doing. So a lot of it goes out over Comcast and another cable provider whose name has just slipped my mind. But a lot of it, more and more of it, is going out over the internet. And this is something that is going to be happening more and more. It actually makes production simpler, that the station may move to a smaller space where the equipment will be simpler, getting it out to viewers will be simpler, but we have to make sure we continue to that point. So we're going to be doing massive fundraising in the next few months, massive reorganization, and we hope that you join in that as well. Either give us a little bit of money when we have a telethon in a month or so, or come down and volunteer, become a member. If you have a program you'd like to put on, we have the equipment. We won't do it, but we'll help you do it. And then we'll make sure that it gets out to the world, either over the cable companies or through the internet.
Yep.
And now I think we've shot our wad completely.
We have.
I'd like to thank Jed and George for being with us. And our crew, as I said, are all volunteers, and we couldn't do this without them. Thanks very much.